Today we start talking about arguments against the existence of God. A further argument against belief in God or the rationality of believing in God is called the hiddenness problem. The most careful articulation of the problem of hiddenness is in the work of John Schellenberg. He has talked about this problem and developed his particular take on it in several of his works. But the argument looks like something along these lines. This is a quote from Schellenberg. If God exists, evidence sufficient to form belief in God is available to everyone capable of a personal relationship with God and not inclined to resist such evidence. Now notice the conclusion already has a couple of qualifiers. The claim doesn't start from the idea that God's existence should be absolutely certain to everyone if there is a God. There's a famous story about a philosopher of science who taught at Yale, Hansen, and Hansen complained that it would be easy, if there is a God, it would be easy for God to convince Hansen that God exists. Hansen complained that God should simply shout from the clouds, thunder from the clouds, "Hey Hansen, you idiot, of course I exist." Now, Hansen's complaint and Schellenberg's attitude are along the same lines, but Schellenberg's is much more refined and measured in comparison to Hansen's. Hansen just thinks if there is a God, everybody should know, it should be obvious to everyone that there is a God, and it's not obvious to him. Schellenberg worries that it's easy to blind ourselves to the truth. Now, if you've ever been in love with anyone ever, you know how easy that is to do. I will not go into any details, and I certainly won't tell you any stories about myself, but when you're in love with somebody, you can find whatever evidence comes in, and you can massage it to support whatever conclusion you're most comfortable accepting at the time. It's like the evidence comes in that the person is just not that into you. Okay, now if that goes on long enough, you finally get the picture, but maybe not initially. Some people are just much more inclined to self-confidence in these areas than other people. And other people are much more inclined to the opposite character trait. They're much more inclined to see everything as a harbinger of doom. So just the slightest lack of concern or interest or something like that is a sign that the relationship is off. So Schellenberg is right. There's lots of ways in which what we call the affective side of our being, the location of the affections, the heart, the emotions, that sort of thing. The affective side of our being can influence what we do with information that comes in. And so if you notice, his conclusion had a clause about resistance to such evidence. So suppose there is evidence sufficient, but you're a resistor of such evidence. Well, I mean, that would be on you, right? Not on God. So Hansen didn't have that qualification. Schellenberg does. He says one disqualifying concern about people who don't believe, aren't convinced that there is a God, is that they might be resistors. A second qualification is maybe there are people that are incapable of having a personal relationship with God. I'm not exactly sure what he has in mind, but I'll leave that to your imagination to think about what kind of people, what kind of human beings he's thinking about. Now notice there's all sorts of advanced theology built in to Schellenberg's conclusion. For example, he's assuming that God is to be thought of in personal terms, because you can't have a personal relationship with a rock. You can't have a personal relationship with an impersonal being. So he's assuming something about standard classical theism when it comes to the nature of God. We will talk about that conception in the second part of the course, but for right now, let's just assume it with Schellenberg and move on and see what the argument looks like. So how is Schellenberg going to support this conclusion? Fundamentally, his argument has three premises. Here's the first one. Some non-resistors lack evidence sufficient to form a belief in God's existence. That's the first premise. So Schellenberg doesn't doubt that there are some people who would resist lots of evidence, maybe any evidence of any sort, for the existence of God. But what he's pointing out is that there are sincere seekers who don't seem to have succeeded in finding what they were looking for. There's no reason to think that they are resistant to evidence. There's no reason to doubt their honesty or the honesty of their inquiry, but they just haven't found what they're looking for. So that's the first premise. It's an empirical claim, but look around, pay attention to your friends, pay attention to other people in the world. And it's not hard to find people that, at least on first glance, and from what we can tell about them, they're honest, sincere inquirers. And they simply haven't found the information that they're looking for. Second premise, a loving God would of necessity seek relationships with all non-resistors. Maybe something stronger is true, but even so, this is a weaker claim. The stronger claim is God would seek a relationship, a loving God would seek a relationship with everybody, absolutely everybody. Now there are Calvinists that will be resistant to such a generalization. One of the standard features of historic Calvinism is the doctrine of limited atonement, that the death and resurrection of Jesus was for the sake of the elect, and that's not all of the people in the world. But apart from Calvinist resistors to the generalization, maybe a loving God would seek a personal relationship with everybody. But Schellenberg weakens it. He says a loving God would, of necessity, seek relationship with all non-resistors. So take those sincere people, sincere seekers, who simply haven't found what they're looking for. God would desire a personal relationship with them. That's the second premise. Third premise, God can't seek a relationship with all non-resistors unless God provides evidence sufficient for belief. Now you might wonder about that claim. So notice, the third premise connects seeking a relationship with non-resistors with providing evidence sufficient for belief. So first, you got evidence. Second, you've got belief. And third, you have a sufficiency claim. Each of those deserves reflection in their own right. Why evidence rather than something else? Why belief rather than some attitude? And why sufficiency as opposed to, for example, adequacy? Maybe adequate evidence is there, but it's not evidence sufficient to generate belief. In any case, we will look at details such as that and other things when we look at the details of the problem of